Hello everyone, this is Martin Shade, and I welcome you to my fifth session of my series Podcasts on Science and Rationality. A couple of hours ago I received a message with a link to a website on which somebody writes about his alleged being convinced of the existence of the monotheistic God in the following way. Someone asked him how he had come to the belief that there is no God. He replied that he had arrived at this conclusion by logic. Thus, he could not sense any God in any way. That is to say, he could not see a deity, feel it, smell it, taste it, or hear it. Then he was asked whether he could sense his logic. That is to say, whether he could see it, feel it, smell it, taste it, or hear it. Of course, he couldn't. Now, if he could not sense his logic, how could he know it existed? The conclusion of the argument thus is that only because one cannot sense something, this does not mean that it does not exist. Thus, God does exist. Before I move on to the rest of the text, let me debunk this obviously fallacious argument. The argument is formally valid, since its conclusion is true, while at least one of its premises is false. For those who are not acquainted with argument theory and logic, an argument is formally invalid only if its premises are true and its conclusion is false. Ideally, the premises entail the conclusion. This is the case for any deductive argument. A classical example is the following. First premise is all men are mortal. Second premise is Socrates is a man. The conclusion to follow from these two premises is Socrates is mortal. Given the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. It could not be otherwise. Exactly this is what we call deduction. The premises entail the conclusion. If all men are mortal, and Socrates belongs to the class men, he is necessarily mortal. Unfortunately, most deductive arguments cannot teach us new truths, for most of them are trivial. So, if we want to learn something new, we must construct so-called inductive arguments. The difference to the former kind of inference is that these arguments' conclusions are not necessarily true if their premises are true. Logically, the best one can achieve is an argument which is maximally plausible. To render an example, the first premise is the sun rose every day in January. Second premise is the sun rose every day in February. Third premise is the sun rose every day in March, and so on until we arrive at premise 12, the sun rose every day in December. Now, the conclusion to follow from this is the sun will rise tomorrow. This kind of argument does not bear any necessary logical truth. All of its premises are true, and yet one cannot conclude that the sun will rise the next day because it might turn out otherwise. Imagine a comet hit the Earth so that a giant cloud of dust eclipsed the sky. In this case, no one would see the sun rise on the following day, and thus the argument's conclusion would turn out false. It may be far-fetched and improbable, yet it is a characteristic different. Indeed, this kind of argument is prone to a lot of mistakes. The one to encounter most often is insufficient statistics. Here again comes an example. Premise 1. I met 40 people with blonde hair in my life. Premise 2. All of these were not very nice to me. The conclusion to follow from these two premises is all people with blonde hair are not nice. Conspicuously, even if the premises are true, the conclusion does not necessarily follow from them. What renders this argument extremely implausible is that there are far more people with blonde hair in the world than 40. There are far more than 400, far more than 4,000, and even far more than 40,000. It follows that the 40 people mentioned represent even far less than 1% of all people with blonde hair, and that thus the conclusion is extremely improbable. Having explained these basics of argument theory and logic, let us now return to the argument put forward by the text someone sent me a couple of hours ago. As I have said already, the argument is formally valid. let us put it the way we put the examples above. Premise 1 is logic exists. Premise 2 is one cannot sense logic. The conclusion to follow from this is something can exist without it being necessary that one can sense it. So far this argument is, needless to say, valid. Now it continues like this. Premise 1 is one cannot sense God. Premise 2 is something can exist without it being necessary that one can sense it. And the conclusion to follow from this is God exists. Now, premise 2 in this argument, of course, is the same as the conclusion from the former argument. This is, of course, permissible. However, although the premises are clearly true, the conclusion does not necessarily follow from them. At best, the conclusion could be God may exist, which overtly is something very different. Furthermore, there is this fallacy. Of course, one cannot sense logic because it is not supposed to form subsisting object in the world. Under the noun logic, in English, we subsume all kinds of inference, and to infer something is an action, that is to say, it is to do something. Against this, God is supposed to be a subsisting object. In logic, everything that is no action or attribute is considered an object, including persons. Ironically, the proposer of the argument for God's existence himself uses logic, thereby proving its existence instead of God's existence. Now, the rest of the text goes on to forward nonsense that insults even the most stupid person's intellect. The proposer claims to have found certain numbers which, of course, incidentally accord with certain numbers involved in facts about the Earth. Goes like this. In the original language, it was revealed there is one word used for lake, ocean, river, or sea, and that word is used 32 times. The word for land is used 13 times. Together they equal 45 references. Divided by the number or times land is used, 13, we get 28.9%, which is equivalent to the land mass on the Earth. Then, if we take the total number of reference, 45, and divide it by 32, it makes 71.1%, which is accurate to the amount of water on planet Earth. Obviously, the author has chosen those numbers arbitrarily, as well as the mathematical operations to do with them. Moreover, if the Earth's landmass is 28.9%, it logically follows that the rest, namely 71.1%, is water, since the entire planet's mass cannot make up more than 100%. By the way, where did you find the clue to refer with these numbers to Earth? This choice is totally arbitrary too, of course. Thank you very much for listening.